r/ProRevenge.
How my ancestor, supposedly, took down a racist businessman. This is an old story that have been told in my family for as long as I can remember. We're talking my grandfather was told it by his grandfather and so on. Note that this story has had close to 200 years to be embellished and twisted, so take everything with a grain of salt rather than scream fake. Even if only a fourth of the story is true, it's still a great story. This is the story of my ancestor we'll call John because that's the name I've always been told. John was a black man in America during the time when slavery was dying out, his grandparents having been brought there from Africa along with their children. John eventually was freed through some means. I've heard both that he paid his way out or the state he was in abolished slavery and he was freed that way, and found himself fighting in the Civil War because he felt it was the right thing to do. During the war he became good friends with a man only known as Mitch who supposedly came from money but had joined against his parents' wishes because he believed in freedom for all. Again, grain of salt. The two were in the same regiment and made it through alive, though some relatives say Mitch lost a leg or an arm in the war. Fast forward to the end of the war and John and his new wife Mary he'd met during the war used the money he'd earned to set up a small shop on the East Coast, most common city mentioned is Boston, in a small neighborhood. The shop became successful, John being a charming man and surprisingly savvy businessman. The neighborhood he'd set up in quickly growing as the city grew, meaning there were always customers who needed whatever it was he sold. I've heard everything from groceries to workers' tools. They lived happily and had 3 children together during the time, spending a decade there when suddenly, presumably accompanied by the roar of thunder and screeches of crows, Mr. Business arrived in town. Mr. Business has apparently been on the wrong side of the war and fought quite hard to keep his slaves, but was also smart enough to sell out other racists when he saw how the tides of the war were rolling. Getting by with no losses except as free laborers. This had been the beginning of the end for his once successful plantation/farm, as all the workers he could find to replace his slaves had wanted things like pay for their services. He'd struggled to find loyal workers that didn't charge more than the absolute minimum, and after a series of bad harvests had chosen to pack up, sell his land and head east to find a new source of income. He arrived and began buying up local businesses that seemed profitable and eventually found out about John's successful store. He was more than happy to discuss a fair price for the store. Until he saw the skin color of the owner, that is. 10 years not enough time to erase a lifetime of institutionalized racism. He began harassing John to sell his rinky-dink store and find a farm to work on, don't quote me, offering way below the actual value, and when laughed out of the store, began trying to sabotage John's business. Getting thugs to throw rocks through windows, sabotaging deliveries, making a scene in the store. John soldiered on though, having grown tragically used to fighting against racism. He also had a lot of friends in the community who helped keep the store floating. Then it was that John's oldest son, who was 13 to 14 at the time, found himself getting beaten up heading home at night from his job, again, blurry details, and wound up with a lot of scars that he'd supposedly been stuck with all his life. John had had enough and, as luck would have it, had an out, having been contacted by his old friend Mitch. Mitch was starting up a farm/plantation in the west/south/southwest and needed loyal workers. He'd offered John a foreman position, good pay and a plot of land to live on with his family. This, dear readers, is when the revenge plan begins. John contacted Mr. Business, offering to sell at 75% what the shop was actually worth, and maybe because his other businesses hadn't worked out, he took it. However, John supplied the contract and proper solicitor to make things legal. The contract basically saying that after midnight of the date of signing, the shop and everything inside would transfer ownership to Mr. Business. Little did he know that that day up until midnight, the shop was having a massive clearance sale, selling everything not nailed down at ridiculous prices to a grateful neighborhood. When they closed up that night and mailed the keys to Mr. Business, there was little left to sell in the store, if anything. John never found out what happened next, as they left town soon after and never returned, but personally I'd like to think that Mr. Business arrived with his workers to an empty store with no deliveries coming, screaming and crying in the mud as he realized he'd been outsmarted by a lesser species. John and his family moved to work at Mitch's farm for the rest of their lives, John supposedly passing away in his 60s. Thank you for reading. Again, a lot of this is probably embellished, if not straight up a fairy tale, but my family all treat it as a true story, and I felt it was too good of a story to not share here.
A response to the post.
The thing is, whether or not this particular story is true, this certainly happened in general and should never have been acceptable.
A response to the post.
My guess is that the people in the neighborhood may have avoided the store if an alternative was available if the new owner managed to get it going. This is Boston, and back then there weren't any big box stores, so you had plenty of small businesses available.
OP's response to this comment.
That's probably what happened. Best as I can gather, John's store was there when the neighborhood was less than 300 and remained the main store until there were 1,000 plus 10 years later, so he was one of the first and someone everyone had talked to more than once. The neighborhood was also mixed, again grain of salt, so I assume the African Americans of the neighborhood didn't fancy visiting a store owned by a racist prick.